everybody, and welcome back to an Invisible and Invisible Illness Awareness Project. I've mentioned ME in a lot of other videos before, but I haven't yet gotten into my personal ME story. So basically, a lot of people end up with ME because they get some sort of a virus, and they're able to pinpoint it to that time where they got sick with the virus and then they just never got better. In my case, it's not as clear cut. I just remember that as early as 12 or 13, I was sitting in class and I could barely keep my eyes open, but I was also staying up late on the computer and napping after school and just sort of typical teenage nocturnal, skewed circadian rhythm. And then going into high school, it was basically the exact same thing. Then I got to college and it got even worse because I just had the freedom to, stay up as late as 7 a.m. sometimes. And at one point I went from staying up till 7 a.m. to then 7 p.m., 8 a.m., 8 p.m., 9 a.m., 9 p.m. with just like a few days between each alternance, and like that whole back and forth within the span of a few weeks. So that obviously wasn't normal, especially because it's not like I was going out partying or anything. So at that point, during my second year, I went to my doctor and I said, I think something's wrong. I seem to be sleeping a lot. I'm always tired, like I'm working part-time, and I always want to sleep up until right before I go to work, and then I get there and I'm not really doing much. I'm just sitting around most of the time, but I'm still tired. And the doctor did like the typical panel of tests and everything came back normal, but at that point I was diagnosed with PCOS and was specifically taking hormonal contraceptive to treat that. And then a few years later, I went off the birth control, and it wasn't until a few years after that when I looked back at my medical records and I saw that I had been diagnosed with PCOS, and I had completely forgotten about it. And I think that also ties into this because brain fog is a symptom, and clearly I was brain fogged for several years before and after that to be able to forget something like that. And then after I graduated college, I spent a year as an au pair, so I was living with this host family. There's people who hadn't known me before and the way I had been for the past decades, but they still noticed the exact same things that other people had, which was that I seemed to sleep a lot and always be tired. And they kind of joked that, like, oh, maybe you have that African sleeping sickness. And then I said, well, no, seriously, like, why do you think it is that I sleep all the time? And I remember the dad saying, well, I don't know, maybe you're depressed. So I went to my doctor then and said the same thing. They ran the same panel of blood tests. Everything, again, was normal. But at that point, kind of the same as in college, like I let it go. I didn't really think any more about it. But the thing is, when I was in college and then afterward as an au pair, and then the next year I was freelance teaching, they were all part-time jobs that weren't really that strenuous. Even when I was teaching, I was teaching at most 16 hours a week and commuting 32 hours, but I was just sitting in the train listening to music or sleeping. So I was able to get away with it because I didn't have to push myself as much. And then I finally did get a full-time job, and I was working 12-hour shifts, 200 hours a month, and really realized that even though I was motivated to be disciplined, I just couldn't push myself to do that. And in the past I had always told myself, like, okay, now I'm gonna have to buckle down and give more, but it had always turned out that in the end I really didn't have to. And that was the time when, you know, I really did have to exert myself a lot more. You know, a lot of times there would be no bus in the morning. I would end up walking like 5 kilometers to or from, you know, pretty much every shift I worked, I was either walking there or walking back. So even though I wasn't exerting myself so much on the job, just being awake at certain times was really strenuous because of the shift work. And getting there, I was also exerting myself quite a bit. So at that point, I went back to the doctor again, and I said, you know, something's not right. I don't have enough energy. And he, again, like, same round of tests. And at that point, I insisted and said, well, if you haven't found anything, then there must be something else. We need to do more tests. We need to look somewhere else. And he did agree to do a few more tests. And then when nothing turned up, he just wanted me to drop it. And I said, well, something has to be causing it, and something is clearly not normal. Which point he got really upset and started yelling about me wasting 15 minutes of his time during this consultation and showed me to the door. So I just went and found myself another primary care doctor, another general practitioner. So that one then referred me to several other specialists to have a whole slew of tests done, basically everything he could think of. And I went to all these different specialists, had everything done, and still nothing turned up. And it was basically at the point where he was out of ideas, but I was getting ready to move. And I realized that 6 months before that, when I had my second impaction that I mentioned in the EOE video, I had never gone back for a checkup. So I went back for the checkup, and I realized that 6 months later, my esophagus still hadn't healed. It probably had never healed since the first impaction 2 years before that. Those last couple months before I moved, I was actually written off sick from work. And that was the point where I was like sitting on the edge of the bed for 30 minutes before I could bring myself to stand up and go to the store, which was 5 minutes away, and just, you know, really hardly doing anything except for going to doctors and going to the store. And, you know, I gave myself those couple months to rest, and then I really had to push myself to move. And I wasn't feeling ready at that point, but I didn't have a choice, so I started working again right after I moved. And I was really just spending all day in bed up until I had to work. Then, you know, working 1 or 2 hours a day as an au pair again. And after that, I would go to the store because I didn't want to risk going to the store early in the day and then not having energy to deal with the kids. But it was still really difficult. So at that point, while I was doing this, I also started eliminating a lot of foods from my diet, and it wasn't until I cut it down to just frozen meat and carrots that, like, all of a sudden I had all this energy. But I mean, first of all, it was really expensive to eat that much meat every day, and second of all, I was concerned about eating that many carrots because I was kind of thinking, okay, well, like, what if my skin starts turning orange or something, and then I'm probably really malnourished, and I had lost a lot of weight right before I started that, and I was worried about that, and I wanted to regain weight, so I didn't stick with it, and I just added a few more foods back in, and went back to being really fatigued all the time. Yeah, so, I mean, and then at that point, I was again spending most of my days in bed, but by restricting my diet, all of my other symptoms had vanished, with like the esophageal problems and like the pain I had in my hand and toes and like intolerance to cold, and all of that stopped. But I was still spending my days in bed, and for like several years I went on just eating like the same 5 foods, and nothing really changed. It was always really a struggle to get up and get out. And after about 6 months as an au pair, that stopped, and then I spent like the next 6 months not working. So really all I had to do was make sure I got food every day and prepare it, and it was still a struggle, but at least I was able to rest as much as possible. And then I started working again, and it was just 12 hours a week, but I did have to bike there, and that was really rough. And you know, it got to the point then where, you know, again, like I wasn't ready to start working. You know, I didn't feel ready, but I had to do it anyway, and I tried to push through it, and I just, you know, got to this point where, like, emotionally I felt like I couldn't take it anymore, because it's such a dark place where I felt like, you know, I can't deal with going to work and going to the store to get food. And I was kind of starting to think, well, do I really need to eat? Maybe I can just not eat tonight, since, you know, I have to work tomorrow, stuff like that. And I was like, you know, I just can't go on like this. I need to stop working so that I can preserve myself, because there's nobody here to take care of me if I get to that point where I can't get out at all. So I was lucky. I did have I was living in like sort of a dorm, and I did have a couple of friends who were able to go to the store for me sometimes when things were really bad. But typically the stuff they got wasn't like it wasn't exactly what I would have bought, so I do prefer to go to the store myself and know what I'm getting. But at that point, once I stopped working, I feel like it really took like 6 months to recover from that phase where it was like really at its worst, where like, you know, really yeah, after like 6 months of not working and just doing the bare minimum, I finally would kind of start to venture out and occasionally do something for fun. But it was still very rare. And that was last summer. So, I mean, I never did go back to work since then. So it's been like, yeah, I'd say nearly 2 years since I've stopped working, but I'm definitely doing a lot better now. Like, obviously, I'm not completely cured. I still struggle, but I'm able to get out a lot more, do a lot more, like, you know, like maybe I'll go out and get food, but then I also manage to do like one other errand a day, and sometimes maybe even like 2 errands a day or something, and then I could do that for like, you know, maybe 2 days in a row before I start to feel really out of it. So I think that definitely is progress. I'm partially scared to go back to work because I know I'm not healed, and I don't want to risk the level of health that I have and end up losing that again. At the same time, I have occasionally applied to jobs and I just haven't got hired, and somehow I feel that like maybe they can sense that something is off somehow, or, you know, I don't know, maybe it's just like fate protecting me or something, because I would be tempted to try and push myself if I got a job just because I really need the money. But I think for my health, it's definitely better to not have to push myself. But yeah, I would say like my improvement has partially been not working over the past couple years, but partially because of this immunotherapy that I've been doing. So I definitely going to be making a video on that soon. So stick around, and I will see you guys next week.